the sound of the volume on the countdown that I created. At some point, we're going to get the countdown volume just right, I promise you. But welcome to Socialism Saturday, guys. Socialism Saturday is, well, when we watch socialism. Because I've become fascinated with this. I accidentally stumbled upon the land of the legitimate socialists when we were doing an investigation into, of all places, the Cambridge, Massachusetts schools. And we found out that they had a legitimate socialist that is doing teacher training for them. And so I went down a rabbit hole of watching socialist content, and now we do it on Saturdays just to keep abreast with what they're doing. Now I have a couple of different options for you tonight. I'm gonna be honest, guys. I'm not feeling great today. I almost canceled the stream, and I was like, no, I have committed to Socialism Saturday. We're gonna do the stream. We're gonna do it, and I'm actually really looking forward to at least one of the two presentations that I have. But just because I'm not feeling great, I can't guarantee that I'm gonna make it through both. Okay, we will definitely watch one, and then I'm gonna do a little reassessment of how I'm feeling, and we may watch another one. And because of that, I want you to vote on which presentation we're going to watch. Now, both of the presentations that I have queued up for Socialism Saturday they are both from Haymarket Books. Haymarket Books is good and reliably socialist. Some of the, like, I'm starting to learn, like, the legitimately socialist YouTube channels where we can get good reliable, like, crazy far left, basically communist content. And so Haymarket Books is reliable, so I have no doubt that both of these presentations are going to be crazy. And actually, both of them are presentations that I've wanted to watch for a minute because I really want to hear and learn and understand the socialist perspective on capitalism. Because as you know, when it comes to critical race theory, any of this gender bullshit that's going on, it's not really about race, it's not really about gender, it's about gaining as much power as possible, destabilizing the system, attacking capitalism, and ushering in a Marxist utopia. And so I think that it's worth understanding the socialist perspective on capitalism. So we have a couple presentations, and I want to tell you about both of them, and then I'm going to have you guys vote on which one we watch first. The first presentation is The Consequences of Capitalism with Noam Chomsky. Of course, of course. The Consequences of Capitalism, a new book by Noam Chomsky, exposes the deep, often unseen connections between neoliberals' common sense and structural power. In making these linkages, they will show how the current hegemony keeps social justice movements divided and marginalized. Isn't it funny that the socialists think that social justice movements are marginalized and divided? And most importantly, we see how we can fight to overcome these divisions. Is there an alternative to capitalism? Chomsky and Waterstone will chart a critical map for a more just and sustainable society. So that is the first presentation that we could potentially watch today. The second is actually the one, if I'm going to spoil it for a second, I actually would love to start with this one. You guys can vote for whichever you want, but I would really like to start with this one. But please vote your conscience. Don't listen to me. If you guys disagree with me, that's totally fine. The next presentation on deck is Keywords for Capitalism, a field guide for decoding the language of power, society, and politics. And let's see what the description says for this. From liberal to the economy, the terms used by pundits and politicians to explain our civic structures tend to obscure as much as they reveal about the reality they ostensibly describe. So isn't that funny? The socialists think that everyone except for them are using language as a weapon. Fascinating. Yet the enduring vocabulary of the radical movement building can be equally opaque when filtered through both the distortions of the status quo and the partisan interests of the activist left. How do we make sense of things like socialism and intersectional that are so routinely used and abused by such a wide array of commentators across the political spectrum? I think that both these presentations sound like really great glimpses into the mind of socialists. So I'm going to put a poll in the chat right now, at least on YouTube. Sorry to those watching on Odyssey, Rockfin, Rumble, Getter, all the other places. Do you want to watch Keywords for capitalism, or you're picking which one you want to watch first. Are we watching Keywords for Capitalism first, or are we watching The Consequences of Capitalism first? Go ahead and register your votes, and I'll give you just a couple minutes to do that while I plug some other stuff. Now, just so you guys know, we do have tomorrow night in my supporter Discord, we did a poll in locals. It has been decided: Idiocracy, which I'm actually pretty excited about. I haven't seen Idiocracy in a minute. It might either be exciting or terrifying. I'm not quite sure. But you can join us for Idiocracy tomorrow in the supporter Discord at 8 p.m. If you are not yet in the supporter Discord, there are many ways that you can get involved. But basically, you need to support my work. You need to become a supporter. It's like there are lots of ways you can support what I'm doing. Supporter in Patreon, all the way from $250 a month, depending on what type of perks you want and what type of support you want to give me. All is welcome, of course. If you don't want to do Patreon, you're of course welcome to join my locals community. Locals is basically one of the more sane places on the internet. I really enjoy it. Of all the platforms I'm on, it is the one that I tend to spend the most time with, because we do 2 Zoom calls every single week with supporters, and those Zoom calls take between, well, probably 8 to 10 hours of my time. So I do actually spend a lot of time on private Zoom calls with my local supporters. We have a great time together. If you're a supporter in locals and haven't yet taken advantage of those Zoom calls, I really think that you would love them and you should really take advantage. But definitely join if you want to get access to movie night for tomorrow. That's going to be one of the ways you can. Of course, you can also become a paid supporter on Substack. All of my Substack articles are free. But if you do want to support the work I'm doing and get access to that Discord, you can become a paid supporter on there. $5 a month, $50 a year, whichever works best for you. And the last way that you can support the work I'm doing is by donating to my Indiegogo campaign. I'm raising money to build a platform and a training program to train 10,000 parents how to find out what the schools are teaching their kids. I have met my initial funding goal, which is awesome, which means that this program will be launching in January. But it would really help me out if you guys could give me a marketing budget. And so many of you have already been so generous, and I'm really appreciative of that. But a marketing budget would really help me to reach out to parents. I'm trying to reach the normies, guys, the people who don't know what's going on, the people who are just concerned about what's going on in the school and are looking for help to understand it. You can find out more about the Schools Exposed program by heading over to unwokearmy.com/parents. The link is in the description down below somewhere, and you can watch my video on it. You can read my documentation. You can decide if it's something that you would like to support or get involved with. And of course, when you support the project at the $50 level or above, you will be one of the very first people to get access to this program when it launches in January. I'm really excited about it. I've already started building out the structure for it. And I think it's going to be great. And I think it's going to be really impactful. And I'm so appreciative of everyone who has donated to the work so far to help me make that a reality. So last thing is that another perk you're going to get as a supporter, and definitely directly relates to Socialism Saturday, is I do have a book club coming up in a little less than a month. We are going to be reading and discussing the Communist Manifesto, which, you know, it is what it is, I suppose. But I do think it is important that we learn this stuff. I think it's important that we read these texts, that we really understand them, that we know our enemy. That's really what this is about at the end of the day. I don't watch socialism content just because, well, no, I was about to say just because I don't want to watch a dystopian reality. I mean, I do actually kind of like watching dystopian realities, but the thing of it is I don't think that we can beat our enemy if we don't understand our enemy. And so we need to watch what they're saying. We need to read the things they're putting out there. I know all this takes time. I know it can be a soul-sucking task, but I do try to make it a little bit more fun. I do try to make it lighthearted, to make it a little bit, it's basically like we're eating our broccoli, but we're covering it in some cheese because we know it's good for us and we need to eat the broccoli. We need to eat the damn broccoli. Otherwise, we're never going to be able to beat them. And I really want to beat them. Even when I'm not feeling so great, I still have enough energy to sit here and watch socialism content so we can understand our enemy and make sure we're fighting back in strategic ways. No, oh, no. You didn't miss this book club next month, October. So we'll look forward to having you as a part of that. All right, guys, let me see. What one are we watching first? Looks like 68% of you want to watch Keywords for Capitalism first. Thank you, guys. I appreciate it. So let's get this party started, guys. Now, again, if you just got here, I'm not feeling great. I'm going to try my very best to make it through and be entertaining. I'm even going to drink this beer because, I'm not feeling great. So, of course, I'm going to drink beer to make that, what could possibly go wrong, really? I actually feel like this might make me feel better. It's just an energy thing. I'm just low energy today. It's all it is. There's nothing wrong with me. I'm not sick or anything. It's just like, eh. So maybe the beer will wake me up. It's a hard raz, which is a raspberry sour, and I selected this because it's red. It's red. The beer does look socialist bought. That's why we're drinking it tonight. The beer looks socialist, so I have to. It's all about a theme, isn't it? It's all about a theme. All right, guys, let's get this party started and let's watch us some socialism. Keywords for capitalism, a field guide for decoding the language of power, society, and politics. I always get nervous when I don't have sound at the beginning. Oh, oh. Hello, Greg. Greg, why are you frozen? There we go. Is he talking to me? I swear this is recorded.
I'm alive. Hello, everybody. And,
oh, thank God.
And thanks for joining us to discuss John Patrick Leary's new book, Keywords for Capitalism. Knew you were repulsed by a word, but didn't know why and what accounted for that repulsion. This is the place for you to be because over the
He's repulsed by the word capitalism. That's his sound, by the way. That's not me. That's his sound. His sound is all fucked up. We're going to work through it.
Similar, and I'm going to talk about the difference between the two. Keywords, the new...
Okay, I just want to make this real clear. That sound problem is on their end. If there's anything that echo is not my fault, okay? That's on their end. Socialists don't know how to use technology. They screw it up literally every presentation we watch. They screw up the audio in some respect. So we're gonna we're gonna get through it. I'm sure they're gonna figure it out. I hope they're gonna figure it out. If they don't figure it out, we're gonna watch the other one. I swear to God.
New language of
capitalism,
which came out a few years ago, and this book, Keywords for Capitalism, John has really become the Raymond Williams of our time. Somebody who has explored the language of power and dominance and the way that words are used to evade and lead. But what's particularly important about this book, Keywords for Capitalism, is that it does more than just sharp the
This guy doesn't even know the title of the book.
For New Capitalism, his earlier book was a book that, looked at the language of neoliberalism and the language of HR. I think
oh my God. Hang on. Hang on.
It seems that's
thank God they fixed it. Okay.
Where language is
thank
so
God. I was losing my mind.
And it seems that so much of our political struggles take place over the terrain of meaning, of words, on platforms that are nothing but words. This is a book that I think has the potential. I mean,
raspberry beer is really good, by the way.
It's not a big book. It's a book for our times in the sense that it's 140 pages, kind of like 140 characters. But it seeks to, in my reading, to build solidarity, to return to the left, an ability to use language to come together. And the way John does.
So I mean, this is basically this is a relatively new presentation, and this is already telling me that they truly believe that the left does not know how to use language as a weapon, and I really do think they believe that. So then, what the hell is going on? Because I think it's pretty clear to me, and I suspect to many of you, that that the left is absolutely using language as their greatest weapon, but are they doing it without realizing it, or do they realize it and they just don't want us to know that they realize it? I don't know the answer to that. Are they really all just useful idiots, or do they understand and they're trying to throw us off the track?
That is a very is a very astute and perceptive reading, and often a very funny reading. I know John personally, and his mordant sense of dry humor comes out on almost every page. I'll just say one thing. He opens it up with a very nice set piece, a very nice scene of visiting his parents in the suburbs of Washington with his brother. And I guess he grew up there, and they used to be living next door, an old immigrant, Eastern European, Russian, maybe Ukrainian couple that according to the Leary, the gossip mill, probably came from a Ukrainian aristocracy, but they were old Europe. And John spent many a lovely afternoon eating hard candy in their mahogany and dark draped meeting room, dining room, gathering room, whatnot. And recently he went back with his brother, and that couple is gone. They were an older couple, and a new Washington power couple has moved in. And during some Christmas social event, he probably seems to be, according to John, a lawyer somewhere downtown in Washington, D.C., asked his brother John the question, so do you follow politics? and from that word politics, John opens up this kind of whole world, a semantic world in which we're trapped into in many ways, which we're imprisoned in, and what politics means. And it's really a wonderful book. So I'll just
why did
John, who teaches in Philadelphia in a public school. He's also the author of
he's a public school teacher. Wait, what? What? He's a public school teacher in Philadelphia? Do you know what else I know about the Philadelphia public schools is that they teach tree equity in math class. They think that maps like geographic maps are racist. And I know this because the school district of Philadelphia has put trainings on the internet saying exactly that. This guy is a public school teacher. Great.
Cultural history of underdevelopment Latin America in the U.S. imagination, and the previous keyword book that I mentioned. So welcome, John. This is really a pleasure, and thank you for asking me to do this.
Oh, thanks for doing it, Greg. Thanks for the kind introduction. It's very flattering to be referred to as the Raymond Williams of our time. I don't know if I can live up to that, given that I'm so heavily indebted to the Raymond Williams of the 70s, but thank you nonetheless. Yeah, the title of the book, I also keep forgetting the title of this.
I know, as I was getting ready, I was like, wait, which is which? Which was the one that came out?
I keep having to Google it. So it's for ease of, to make it easy for us and to be clear, I sometimes just, keywords 1 and keywords 2 is how I've shorthanded it to myself.
Yeah.
Yeah. So thanks a lot again. So the this book, I would say you started by talking about some of the differences. So maybe we can begin with that. I mean, the opening story about this kind of annoying neighbor of my parents who asks my brother, and the thing that was particularly annoying about it to me at the time was that my brother was about the same age as this guy, and he said, so he was like, so are you interested in politics? Like, he was a precocious little kid, and the kind of condescension was hard to distinguish from that banal understanding of what politics was, the sort of the thing that happens on TV, or the thing that sort of qualified and very smart people downtown in DC do. And so the book is kind of divided into various sort of rejoinders or various ways of understanding that guy's meaning of politics and that question. So the book's divided into like kind of three categories of terms, and one is the horse race. So the words that we encounter in kind of electioneering and election coverage in basically mainstream news media discussion of, you know, the government basically, and then politics as the place of movements in which average people participate. Since the main difference, you know, the metaphor of the horse race is sort of an appropriate one for politics as it's conducted in official circles and on TV, because the horse race is a sport in which like only a unique species can participate. Like we can't, all we can do is watch, you know, we're not horses. So the movement chapter is about the time when we get to enter, as it were, the race. And then the last section is structures. So the kinds of, I guess, the kinds of things that probably...
Okay, I'm feeling the need to do a pause and do a little disclaimer here. If you have not yet watched socialist content, if you don't understand what you're hearing right now, it's totally cool. You just need to sit with it for a while. They do this in every single presentation. It's like these people speak a completely different language. But I promise you, it is worth taking the time to understand what they're saying. Because it will explain so much about what you're seeing go on in the world. But if you're feeling like he's very dry and he's saying like word salady stuff, and he's saying like stuff you don't understand and you don't like, and you're not following what's going on, that is totally and completely normal when you first start watching this type of content. So just hang in there. I promise it gets better and it's totally worth it.
Neighbor would not have considered if, you know, we had answered him like, yeah, we're really interested in the class question and racism and the place of materialism
Hang
in
on.
contemporary American.
So no, I'm showing this to make a point. Michael Moore made a documentary, Capitalism: A Love Story. Interesting watch also. No. That's not what we're watching here. Michael Moore is an entertainer. Michael Moore did that documentary, and I've seen that documentary. That is like a CNN socialist type of thing. That's not real. What we're watching is the real deal. This is the real stuff. This is so much further left than anything Michael Moore has ever done. It's ridiculous. So, and I think it can be very easy for people to confuse that, because so many people say, oh, what goes on is so, like, AOC is a socialist, Bernie Sanders is a socialist, CNN is all socialist, Marxist, blah, blah, blah. No, they're not. They're like moderate Democrats. And what these people say in their presentations, what the real socialists were saying like 5 years ago, is what people like Bernie Sanders are saying today. So these people are further ahead than anyone you're seeing in the mainstream media.
Society, those sorts of questions that one wouldn't really compute with somebody who's sort of steeped in that horse race stuff.
Yeah, I think we all have. I mean, leftists have all had that moment where you run into. I mean, this person seemed particularly obnoxious, and the juxtaposition with the loss of a kind of old world gentility. No matter how probably odious their politics, they probably were. They fled the Russian Revolution.
I never discussed it, so I can't remember.
Yeah. But that was for me. I mean, I'm a nostalgist and a declinist. So like, you know, the loss of that kind of old world, and in its place coming, you know, what has come was a very graphic image. But we've all had trouble.
Yes,
we've all, I think,
this is correct. This is the pure, uncut fentanyl version of socialism. That's correct. Great analogy.
And, you know, as MSNBC, as you know, 538, as polling, as repeating conventional wisdom, as, you know, channeled through cable TV, but the same five people. But you know, there is also a kind of you know, another category of people who want to talk about politics that are generally liberal and progressive, but don't have the apparatus to talk about you know, to get beyond, to break out of that miasma that you capture so well. And I think that that's what your book does. It gives people a kind of roadmap to get out of the, you know, to break out of the MSNBC prison.
Listen.
I didn't. And
They're giving people the tools to break out of the MSNBC prison. Why would socialists, real socialists, want to break people out of the MSNBC prison? Because for these people, MSNBC doesn't go far enough. These people don't like the progressives. They don't like the liberals. They don't like the Democrats. They don't like MSNBC. They don't think it goes far enough. Exactly. These people believe that MSNBC is too far right. Exactly.
this is, I guess, one difference between, you know, Keywords 1 and Keywords the sequel is the, you know, the first book was just about terms to avoid, basically. I mean, like, all of them were evasions, as you said, like entrepreneurship and innovation are just ways of not saying what you should be saying, or human capital is a way of not saying labor, and leadership is just a way of not saying the boss, you know, that kind of stuff. So, but I didn't want to just sort of categorize all the like dumb things people say on MSNBC, you know, in part because it's easy, and
all the dumb things people say on MSNBC.
But in part because, you know, those the you know, the dumb things people say on MSNBC can be kind of ways of getting to other things, or ways of kind of reframing other questions. And so, you know, talking about the history of, say, like the term, I don't know, the term like the kitchen table.
Yeah.
But this idea of like kitchen table issues is this kind of like banal term that you almost barely at this point, and this is kind of like the function of terms like this, you just don't even think about what it means or what it might mean when you hear it. You just, it's a word that, a term that we are allowed to be complacent about,
Yeah.
and to just sort of have it roll off our backs. But when one digs into its history, it's sort of a more interesting history than you might think. And you know, it has a origin story as women from the American Association of University Women coins it in like a focus group in Iowa before the primaries, before the Dukakis election, the 88 or 87 or whatever primaries. And you know, it's a way of trying to leverage the attention of the Democratic Party to focus on home care, women's wages, elder care, and the sorts of political issues that would have been categorized as like women's issues. And so what this woman's effort was to do was to kind of make it a central plank rather than a kind of marginal plank of the party. And it's now become, you know, a kind of marginal plank precisely from the overuse of the term kitchen table issues to just sort of suggest, you know, all sorts of things like the household metaphor for national finances. You know, it sometimes suggests that, like when a politician will say, like, we have to balance our budget like your house balances its budget, that sort of thing. Or it just refers to like important stuff and in the most general sense.
Yeah.
But so like sort of digging into that term kind of might I hope anyway help us sort of extract the meaningful core from all of the sort of bullshit it's been submerged in.
Yeah, and it's also linked to, I mean, you know, it's one thing to talk about kitchen table you know, but you know, kitchen table politics and kitchen table issues, but if they're, you know, it's when they're linked to, you know, technocratic solutions that are, you know, part of the whole general switch
So for these people, the only solution that exists to all of the world's problems is to get rid of capitalism. That's what they want. So that so why they're pissed off at MSNBC is they're saying MSNBC is using the words of basically like the colonizers. They're using their same language. They're talking about kitchen table issues, things like that. These people really think that the only way to fix society is to abolish capitalism entirely. So they're pissed off that MSNBC is not on board with their little plan.
To bipartisanship, compromise, a kind of, a hollowing out of a New Deal concept of redistribution. I mean, one could imagine kitchen table issues being, national health care being, including dental insurance but it was as you write, it's the language of patriarchy, kitchen table, balancing the budget, home economics 101 applied to politics. So it's the kind of reinforcing and reimagining the patriarchy, but in this age of neoliberal capitalism.
Yeah. So the story, the Dukakis fails to go anywhere with this term or with this concept, and then when Clinton tries to do his health reform in '93 or whenever it was, the famous ad of, now I'm forgetting the name, Louise and
Harriet and
Harry and somebody, Harry and Louise, something like that.
You're talking about the healthcare.
Yeah, they're sitting at the dinner table, at the kitchen table, and the husband is kind of like aloof and oblivious, and he's reading the paper, ignoring his wife, and then she's reading the bill, and it's this doorstop of a bill, and she's sort of comes out with all this kind of homespun wisdom about how oppressive it's going to be and how much it's going to ruin them. And they say, and that ad is kind of often credited with sort of galvanizing opposition to this signature issue, this fundamental issue of what was initially supposed to be a kitchen table issue, but now it's used to signify the kind of authority of the home and the kind of fortress of the home against intrusion of the welfare state, or against the intrusion of a collective enterprise of any kind.
And certainly, I mean, certainly the New Deal rebuilt and stabilized the patriarchal family and the male's role in it. Even
wait, the New Deal restabilized the patriarchal family. What do you guys think that means? I would like your interpretations in the chat. The New Deal reinstitutionalized the patriarchal family. I have an idea of what I think that means, but I want you guys to tell me what you think it means. Why don't they like the New Deal? I don't know what the Black community means. I don't know what this means. FDR became daddy. Isn't that an interesting interpretation, Catherine? Any other ideas? Kept the family together. Okay. Why don't they want to keep the family together? Why might they perceive the New Deal to be a problem in that way? I've got great teacher wait time, guys. Maybe that it saved capitalism, and that made it so that the old white men stayed in power. The New Deal wasn't socialist enough. That's exactly correct. The New Deal wasn't socialist enough. The family equals capitalism. Exactly, Incognito. What did we hear from that socialist that wanted all kids born via surrogacy a couple weeks ago? She said that the family was the technology that supports capitalism. They want to abolish the family. This is just another indication of that. See, this is why we watch these guys, because you got to like hear between the you got to learn how to understand their language and to learn what they really care about. And sometimes that takes suffering a little bit to get there, but we got there, didn't we? All right, let's keep going.
Even as it created opportunities in other ways for women, but it's one thing to restabilize the patriarchal family around an economics of however flawed economic redistribution, as opposed to restructuring, reimagining the patriarchal family in an age in which, you know, the gutting of the welfare state and the turn towards market solutions to solve all problems and
the gutting of the welfare state and the turn to market solutions to solve all problems. They loved that welfare state. They loved mommy and daddy government welfare state.
Dominance of corporations and all of the paperwork and bureaucracy and humiliation that goes with corporate rule.
Yeah.
One of the things that I was struck, I had no idea about this, and I guess once I read it, it was like, oh yeah, of course, that Barack Obama used the word folk more than
not folk. Folks, plural, yeah.
Oh, hang
Folks.
on. This is really fascinating. I didn't know this. The first thing they did in Cuba was to remove women from their homes and create children's circles where the government took care of the kids. Isn't that fascinating? Thank you for telling us that. I don't know exactly how to pronounce your name, but I appreciate the input.
Folks more than any other president, but I don't know if you remember if you quantified it. But
somebody did, but it's
did, yeah.
Like orders of magnitude more than anyone else had ever said, folks.
Yeah. So I mean, what was that? That's like, so, you know. Again, like all of these words you could see in a Frank Capra New Deal movie, but you know, like they would have a completely different valence, right?
Yeah. So I mean, the one argument. The reasonable argument in favor of folks. So this is an example of where, you know, this book isn't just about naughty words that we should stop using, because, you know, folks has a certain utility in English for addressing a collective of people.
Yeah.
We don't have a second person.
Tortured some folks.
In his kind of signature, you know, style of speaking, we tortured, and then he followed it up with the kind of a sort of scolding of, you know, left-wing critics not to be too sanctimonious about the tough job that those folks had done in Iraq. And so in the space of two sentences, he referred to torture victims as some folks, and then like also used folks to refer to their torturers. And so it was this kind of remarkable evasion of any kind of distinction between those two, or responsibility, a moral difference that might exist between torturers and their victims. And so for me, like, besides just the grammatical utility of folks, the way that it becomes important in kind of political discourse, and why it's, I think, a certain way, a good way of capturing a certain feature of Obama style liberalism, is that it's supposed to conjure the sort of national cross-party consensus that basically denies or at least downplays the persistence of fundamental conflicts, like, you know, class conflict, racial conflict in the sort of literal sense of an imperial war in Iraq, and all of the kind of violence that conjured up. So it was in using, and his overuse of the word folks is, I think, kind of part of, is a rhetorical tick that was revelatory of a certain refusal to actually engage those very real conflicts, and to sort of conjure this sort of phony consensus that is much harder, I think, now to believe in, even if, you know, Biden is sort of desperately trying to keep its flame burning.
Yeah, I mean,
Biden is desperately trying to keep its flame burning. Oh my God!
And Our Man Nirvana has that famous passage that there exist two types of people in the world: the torturable and the untorturable. There's two classes: the torturable and the untorturable. And then he has a riff on that, who's torturable and who's untorturable. And he said, them when you see them, and all of that stuff. And here, I mean, not to make too much of it, but here Obama is basically saying we're all torturable. I mean, if we're all folks, the folks are being tortured and the folks are doing the torturing, then we're all part of the torturable class at this point.
Yeah, that is yeah.
Well,
it's sort of like rhetorical tick that all politicians, a sort of fake populism that all politicians engage in.
Yeah. Well, that also brings to the foreign policy dimensions of a lot of this. I mean, you for the most part focus on capitalism as the context in which language is formed and fought over and contested and deformed, and not to make any kind of big analytical distinction between the two, but militarism has its own, this kind of endless war and constant warfare has this own has its own impact on language. There's an essay. I'm not a big fan of Arthur Schlesinger Jr., but he does have this really wonderful essay at the end of the Vietnam War about how the constant militarism of the United States. By this point, I think Laos, Cambodia had been revealed, and the full nature and extent of what the United States was doing. I don't know, maybe the Church Committee had revealed it. I don't know, but he talked about there's been a semantic collapse. Militarism has caused a semantic collapse that has disassociated words from their meanings, and it's just interesting. He doesn't make that much of it, but when you think of the kind of world we live in of constant misinformation and hard to pin things down, the kind of crisis of false news and misinformation. It's often not traced back to the history of endless counterinsurgency and endless psychological warfare, which has contributed to the defamation of language to some degree. But there is one. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
No, but this is all just to get to the one big example in the book and that you have that does make this connection, and to some degree is filibuster. You want to say a little bit about the origins of the word filibuster and how it circles back from foreign to the domestic?
This is when they're okay. What they're about to try to do is he's probably going to try to make the case for getting rid of the filibuster. He's going to use some language game about the origin of the word filibuster to try to make the case for why we should get rid of the filibuster now.
Yeah, so filibuster is a word that comes to at least our language from Spanish, from filibustero, which is a word that was used to refer to kind of privateers or private military operators in the Caribbean in the 19th century. And so the greatest of them all, the most relatively successful, was William Walker, who was a Tennessean who formed a private army to invade and briefly occupy Nicaragua in 1850. And I'm forgetting, maybe 1852 or anyway, 1850s. And he, with backing from some Southern slave agriculture interests, he occupies the country, briefly, assumes power there, reinstitutes slavery, or at least attempts to, before he's overthrown and summarily executed by United Central American Army. And so in Central America, his name is pretty well known. I mean, and the story is pretty well known.
No. Are they? Okay, I may not have this right because I'm pretty sure I only understood like half of what he said, but is he actually saying that the guy who invented the term filibuster did it like he was like he imported slavery to South America and was generally a really bad is he actually about to say that the term filibuster is racist because the guy who invented the term filibuster imported slavery to South America, and that's why we should get rid of the filibuster today because the guy who invented the term, he's saying it's racist. That's hilarious. It really all does come back to like racism with these people. Everything. They will try to find a way to say that every single thing is racist.
Of anti-imperial heroism to overthrow him and execute him, but he's not remembered here at all because this is like the history of filibustering. It's not just William Walker. There's Narciso Lopez, who goes to Cuba twice and fails twice. So this kind of tradition or this history of mobilizing private armies to conquer territory in Latin America and Caribbean for the purposes of just brute exploitation and the purposes of instituting and expanding slavery is just like, this is this is a major part of American foreign policy in the Americas in the 19th century that many people don't know about, I think, in this country. And so for me, it's very interesting, and there is a kind of clear lineage from this kind of racist adventurism of filibustering to the way that the term has become used.
The racist adventure of filibustering. Teresa, no, you are not stupid. No, you are exactly correct. He just said that filibustering is a racist adventure.
In kind of legislative procedure in the United States as a way of mostly blocking civil rights legislation. So in the 30s and before, in the Jim Crow era, to filibuster is generally to, it's not worth getting into all the arcane kind of Senate rules about why you can do it, but to interrupt legislation on civil rights. It's like the kind of go-to policy for that. And then now it's kind of been, I guess, expanded perhaps somewhat. It is not only used, although it is very much still used to disrupt civil rights legislation or legislation that has to do with racial justice, but it's also, like right now, invoked.
The filibuster is only used to disrupt civil rights legislation, and it has a history that is rooted in a racist adventure. This is what we do Socialism Saturday for, guys. And if you don't think that's an argument that's going to make its way into Congress at some point, you wait for it. You wait for it. They aren't done trying to get rid of this filibuster yet. Okay? They still got a couple more. They still got several more weeks before this election. You wait for it. Someone's going to go into Congress and make the case that in fact, they already have made the case that the filibuster is racist. I've actually seen this. I've seen them do this before. These people's talking points make their way into the halls of Congress. This is why we do Socialism Saturday. This right here.
For abortion rights, to block abortion rights or to take them away, and it's just so it's an example of the way of like one way in which this kind of history of racist violence and conquest in the 19th century.
And I just want to remind everyone who may have come in a little bit late, this person who wrote he's doing this interview because he wrote a book called Keyword for Capitalism with a legitimately socialist book publisher. But this person that we're watching right now talk about the filibuster being racist is a public school teacher in Philadelphia. He is a public school teacher in Philadelphia. What are those kids learning? I wonder.
Sort of still haunts haunts the present by kind of, but particularly in an interesting way now, because it's the filibuster is, we think of it, I think we talk about it mostly as a sign of American just impotence and incompetence or failure, right? Like in the current political context, filibustering is just like a sign of what a fiasco American government has become. But it has this very kind of aggressive and very deliberate and very kind of focused campaign history,
Right.
This militaristic campaign history.
Yeah, yeah, and then there's a lot of ways, I think, with this, a lot of the language, the way language I've incorporated. You pull out the word. And, I earlier on I mentioned Raymond Williams, but there's a long history of this kind of exposition, this kind of using language to get beyond what, and the other thing, just more because I think he captured Raymond Williams. I think you carry on the best tradition of Raymond Williams in terms of his analytical abilities, but there's another, Ambrose Bierce, who wrote the devil, he had a column in San Francisco, Devil's Dictionary, and he was quite the critic of capital and labor and colonialism. He himself saw language as a way of as mystification, as the way of, like he put out this, what he called the Devil's Dictionary, which we define. So,
a socialist saw language as a way to gain power. Oh, I am shocked at this revelation. Exactly, Sin. Their goals, their only goals. Oh, every time someone on the left opens their mouth, we have to see it through this lens. They are trying to gain as much power as possible, destroy institutions, rid the world of capitalism, usher in their Marxist utopia. And language is their greatest weapon, which is why they're writing books trying to dictate to all of us what the language is that we are supposed to use and what we are not supposed to use. It's all good, Sim. We know what you meant. I appreciate the super chat.
Labor is one. His definition of labor is one of the processes by which A acquires property for B. And then he goes on to talk about land, a part of the Earth's surface considered as property. The theory that land is property subject to private ownership is the foundation of modern society and eminently worthy of superstructure. Carried to its logical conclusion means that some have the right to prevent others from living. For the right to own implies.
They just implied that we should not have the right to own land or private property. I'm going to say that again. They just implied that we should not have the right to own land or private property, because in our owning land and private property, we are denying other people the ability to live.
The right to own implies the right exclusively to occupy.
Yes.
And in fact, laws of trespass are enacted whenever property in land is recognized. It follows that if the whole area of terra firma is owned by A, B, and C, there will be no place for D, E, F, and G to be born or born as trespassers. I mean, it's kind of remarkable entry, considering that, one, he's writing at the tail end of Frederick Jackson Turner and the whole myth of the frontier, and two, he's foreshadowing a whole class of people who will have no place to be. But anyway, I just wanted to also say that you would not just you do not just invoke Raymond Williams in analysis. You invoke Ambrose Bierce in his wit and humor.
Oh, well, thanks. It's good company to be in. I am a big fan of the Devil's Dictionary. I mean, it is kind of remarkable how kind of I think the title is meant to refer to the kind of the deeply kind of cynical, sardonic vehemence of a lot of his definitions, like the one you just read, and one of my favorites is marriage. I can't remember his definition of it, but something for our listeners to look up.
Well, one of my favorites is emancipation, because it's so Foucauldian. I mean, I'm not particular. But emancipation is, he defines it as a bondsman, a slave's change from the tyranny of another to the despotism of himself. He was a slave. At word he went and came. His iron collar cut him to the bone. Then liberty erased his name and tightened the rivets and inscribed his own. I mean, it's just about it's hard to get something better about the way that we internalize self-discipline and modernity via a process of abstract control and self enslavement in some ways. So anyway, he was quite prescient in many of his entries.
And I guess, in a way that's like, I don't quite share his I don't know, writing style, but his conciseness, I guess, either. But there's something about, his general approach to language as something that, on the one hand, conceals, and that we can kind of crack open and see what it conceals when it's used as sort of like land or emancipation, is to kind of promise something that it doesn't deliver, or promise something that comes with a catch attached, or with a, and then but that also language is something which we use in ways that kind of sometimes undermine us, and sometimes things that which we use for our own kind of political purposes. So not just sort of like bad words that are pure deception or pure mystification or pure evasion, but concepts that we can't avoid, but which bear within it some kind of meaning, which, if we kind of drill down on it or access it, can illuminate some aspect of our political world. Like the land definition was a pretty good one, I think. In that, we can't avoid talking about it. We can't avoid walking on it. We can't avoid trespassing or buying or renting it. And
so there's a material reality undergirding this that ultimately can't. It's not all. I mean, you have that quote by Michael Denning that if I marked it, but now I can't find it.
What's that? Populous.
Yeah, we don't. Yeah, if politics.
This guy is one of the most horrible interviewers I've ever seen in my life. They're awful.
Let me give it to you exactly. I know what page it's on.
How much longer is this?
Politics, we would all be populist.
Okay.
Yeah. And so what can you maybe I speak a little bit more on that, because that obviously, there's that has had an enormous impact on politics in Latin America that I know the most of, where Laclau and Mao's hegemony and socialist strategy, the really final break with discourse from a kind of material class politics in the final instance, that it is about coming up with a kind of populist assemblage that somehow speaks to the people, and that was Chavez, and that's and to a large degree that's been at least one of the main frameworks in which the strength and weakness of the left in Latin America has taken place in. But I take it that you see limits in that, and that there are some connection. You can't completely demore these words from the materiality and class relations, not materiality, but the class relations.
Yeah, and not just class relations, but all of the sort of social, in the broader sort of like ideological, all the kinds of social networks in which language takes shape, in which it's embedded, racial, class, sexuality, and so on. I think what Denning is saying there, as I understand it, is to point to, yeah, the way in which if a kind of populist language that a politician or a pundit uses, like a kind of language of kind of democratic legitimacy, or dropping your G's when you're speaking at a barbecue, or, you know, riding a motorcycle during the like election to show that you're a salt of the earth regular guy, all those sorts of things. If all of these sort of like linguistic performances hide a material reality, right? I mean, that sometimes they articulate it and express it, and sometimes they're merely hiding it. And so what I try to do in that particular, this is the folks chapter, you know, again, is to sort of
he wrote a whole chapter on folks.
This word like actually gets used in some of those performances, but also to talk about some of that kind of material reality that sort of undergirds and gives shape to the term, and also kind of like shows us some of what's wrong with it. So I mean, one of the examples.
Okay, I'm gonna pause. I don't know how much more of these two I can take. Maybe it's because I'm feeling just a slightly under the weather. Maybe it's because this is really bad. But I want to put it to the chat. I'm going to put it to the chat. So we have, for those who came late, this was, I picked out 2 presentations to watch, and I am glad that we did watch some of this. I am glad because we got a few key takeaways. Should we switch to the other video? Yes? No? Because I'm not getting anything from this guy, if I'm honest. It's like, yeah, okay, we've gotten a couple like tidbits in terms of like, they're trying to make the case that the filibuster is racist because someone in the 1500s in South America did something. But like, this interviewer is horrible. Their sound is bad. It's really bothering me. I have a headache. I don't know if I can take any more of this. I don't know. Let me know. Okay. Basically, everyone is saying we should switch to the other video. All right. Everyone is saying we should switch. We put in a good college try. We did, and this is just the way it goes sometimes, guys. So we're going to switch. We're going to switch to the Noam Chomsky video. Hang on. I feel like we've gotten what we can from that other one. Oh my gosh. Maybe I am getting sick and I don't know it. Okay, hang on. Let's do the Noam Chomsky one. All right. Thank you for hanging in there. Hopefully this one will suck a little bit less. This is The Consequences of Capitalism with Noam Chomsky. Let's go. Fun fact, actually, before we get into this. So my roommate, my freshman year in college, I remember like very early on, she was she had so I went to Boston University, and she had looked at a lot of schools in Boston. Apparently she had found herself at MIT at one point. And Noam Chomsky was a professor at MIT at the time, and she didn't know who he was. And she came back to the room and was like, "Yeah, I met with all these professors, including that Chomsky guy." And I was like, "You met with Noam fucking Chomsky?" And she's like, "Yeah, so my freshman college roommate had a meeting with Noam Chomsky when she was thinking about transferring to MIT. True story." Anyway.
Welcome to everyone tuning
the sound
in
is
from around
fucked
the
up
country
again.
and
That's
around
on
the
theirs.
world.
They're going to get
Thank
it together.
Thank you very much for joining us. And thank
I
you,
cannot
Haymarket
believe
Books, for
the
inviting
sound
me to
is
be
fucked
part
up
of this conversation.
again.
My name is Janine Jackson. I'm the program director at the Media Watch Group FAIR and the producer and host of FAIR's radio show Counterspin.
Wait, there's a socialist media watchdog group named FAIR? That explains so much. Okay, again, the sound is on their end. Socialists suck at technology. This is not my fault. This is their fault. Hopefully they get it together.
It is my distinct pleasure to be part of what I expect to be a relaxed, informative, and forward-leaning conversation about this useful new book, Consequences of Capitalism, Manufacturing Discontent and Resistance. The book reflects the college course that Noam Chomsky
Why
and
is
Marv
she presenting from a
Waterstone
closet?
co-taught and co-teach at the University of Arizona.
Oh, good.
Noam Chomsky is Institute
Wait.
Professor Emeritus in the Department of...
You may not have caught that because the sound is so fucked up. Apparently, this book is based on a course that they teach at the University of Arizona. This video is not too long ago. I mean, within the last year, certainly. So if you are at the University of Arizona or have a child at the University of Arizona, you can take a course about the consequences of capitalism. How great is that? Can someone tell Carrie Lake that, please? She probably might want to know that, considering, you know, she's going to be governor of that state, probably.
Linguistics and Philosophy at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and Laureate Professor of Linguistics and Agnes Nelms-Howry Chair in the Program in Environment and Social Justice at the University of Arizona. He's the author of numerous works, including most recently, What Kind of Creatures Are We? Optimism Over Despair, and Internationalism of Extinction. Marv Waterstone is Professor Emeritus in the School of Geography and Development at the University of Arizona, where he's been on the faculty for more than 30 years. He's the former director of the University of Arizona Graduate Interdisciplinary Program in Comparative Cultural and Literary Studies. His most recent books are Wageless Life.
You took queer theory at the University of Arizona? Do you still have your stuff? I know it was a long time ago.
Geographic Thought, A Praxis Perspective, co-edited with George Henderson. Consequences of Capitalism is an incisive, and I would underscore a readable exploration of our present predicament and ways out of it. It's rooted in a careful understanding of why and how things are the way they are, and on the ways that people have pushed their way out of oppressive systems and circumstances in the past. It is, I would say, a dynamic reading of history with the future in mind. In this book, you will hear many political, historical fantasies, complicated and deflated by fact, and many tossed around concepts rooted, given authors and context and impacts. I am handing my copy over to my 17-year-old daughter, who wants to understand how things have come to be how they are, how these systems that so obviously harm so many are maintained, including by people who see themselves as humanists, and how she might use her anger and compassion.
Humanist is the opposite of capitalist?
Criticism done well is a constructive act. Understanding the structures and systems, including systems of personal epistemology, the way we think we understand things, how those systems in motion have played out over particular circumstances, understanding that is central to making meaningful and lasting change. Maybe not sufficient, but necessary. When you can clearly see the knot, it still feels like a knot, but you can see the openings. You can see the strings that might be tugged. And I would add, learning actual history is a great way to unlearn hopelessness. So again, I'm very happy to be here. I'm happy you all are here as well. Let's get started.
Let's do it.
I'm
Fix
going
your
to direct
sound.
my questions, as I've said, but certainly Marv, Noam, if either of you want to follow up on something the other has said, please feel free to do that. I want to start with you, Marv. I pick up the paper and I read that inflation surges, putting more heat on Washington. I read of Kyle Rittenhouse, who murdered 2 people with the rifle he brought to a protest against police brutality. Kenosha trial to peg whether teen is hero or reckless gunman. I read Ethiopia's civil war is a problem U.S. troops can solve. These news reports are presented as just informing me about what's happening in the world, you know, but the weight of presumption that they come with is staggering. I need to believe that inflation is a bad thing, that the US justice system isn't racist, and that US military interventions in other sovereign countries is not only...
Wait, do these people believe that inflation is a good thing? She just said, I need to believe that inflation is a bad thing. Like, do these people believe that inflation is good?
justified, but moral and effective. These are not arguments the reporting makes, they're premises. Acceptance of these ideas.
Hang on. People are asking when this is from. Let me I need to exit out of the full screen. Hang on. It is from, it's relatively recent. I'm going to tell you that. November 15th, 2021. So less than 1 year ago. So very recent.
The price of admission, if you would, to serious people, public conversation. So it isn't just that I'm reading about upsetting events, it's the airlessness, the sense that those in charge have it all on lock. I can see the wrong, but there's no suggestion of a lever to grab hold of. And after all, I'm just one person. My powerlessness is part of the lesson that I take away. So those corporate media terms of debate, unspoken but governing, have something to do with what you talk about throughout the book as common sense. Would you tell us about, outside even of the specific content of it, the nature of this common sense in shaping our thinking and political possibilities?
Well, thanks, first of all.
Oh
to
God,
Margaret,
all
and
their
thanks to Janine and
sound
Jan
is
to be
fucked
part
up.
of the
Great.
Conversation. This is actually a really terrific question to start with, because not only is the substance of the answer going to be revealing certain kinds of ways that the world operates, but it also gives us a chance to talk a little bit about why the course and subsequently the book are organized the way they are. That is, that the course itself and the book that emerged from the course has a particular kind of trajectory to it. And it had a certain set of goals in mind when we began to do this course in 2017, 1 week before the inauguration of Donald Trump's first, and we hope last term. In any event, the intent of the course is, as you've described, to unpack certain things that we take absolutely for granted and leave unexamined as a way to both understand their constructedness, that is, the fact that these are not natural states of the world, but are assiduously and arduously produced, reproduced, and reinforced by those people who are advantaged by the way things operate at the moment. But the idea that those things are constructed, that they could be constructed otherwise, is an underlying sort of premise for both the course and for the book. That is, if things are not operating in the way that is in many, many people's interests, the way to begin to produce change in those circumstances is to unpack the kinds of things that we typically leave completely unexamined and taken for granted. And this is one way of understanding what common sense is. Common sense is, in fact, the way that we think we understand how the world operates. And it's an essential feature of being a human being, is to be able to take certain kinds of things for granted. If we had to examine every single thing that happened in the world every day, we'd be essentially paralyzed. And so there are ways in which we have internalized certain kinds of rules, certain kinds of behaviors, certain ways of understanding that in particular situations, the way the world operates is the way we expect it to operate. It returns to us the kinds of phenomena that we think we have come to expect. And as I say, if we didn't have that operating knowledge, which Anthony Giddens, someone we quote in the book, talks about as practical consciousness, we would essentially be paralyzed. We'd have to examine every single thing we do and move from there. So clearly that's not the case. But there are many terms when what we think we understand about the world is simply things we have internalized, as I say, taken for granted, and don't bring out for any further examination. And this is where things can become very, very troublesome. And those, as I say, who are advantaged by the status quo have a tremendous stake, not only in using what we think we understand about the world as a descriptive phenomenon, but as a normative phenomenon. Not only are these the way things are, as you put in your question when you read in this paper or that paper, these are the facts, but there's also a normative component to it, that this is the way things ought to operate. And as we understand, the people who are, as I say, are advantaged by the way things are, by the status quo, are constantly reinforcing that particular view of the world and disallowing virtually anything else to come into play. And
what did he just describe when he says that the people who are advantaged by the system will constantly be reinforcing that perception of the world? What did he just describe? And I'm not talking about what he said here. I'm talking about what idea did he just describe that we hear an awful lot of from Ibram X. Kendi and Nicole Hannah-Jones. Any ideas in the chat? I really hope you guys know this. What system is he describing when he's saying that people in power will, kind of, basically systemic racism. He just described systemic racism. Yeah, whiteness, privilege. Now, what does whiteness mean? Whiteness doesn't mean whiteness. What does whiteness mean? He did just describe systemic racism. Whiteness means capitalism. Exactly. So their argument is that people in power, people at the top, the entrepreneurs, the bosses, the landlords, all the people that they don't like, people in power will only build and acknowledge systems that reinforce their power. That's how they perceive capitalism. That's why they think that capitalism is the enemy.
We can talk about this in any number of ways. But in one interesting way, a kind of antonym to common sense is nonsense. That is, the things that we think might be wrong with the way the world is presented to us are themselves ruled out by this constant drumbeat of the production of a particular common sense. And as I say, people become very much committed to understanding the world in a particular way, which is why it's very difficult to move people's opinion, views, perspective on things that really matter to them. And one of the phenomena that I think is of interest in terms of common sense is that it tends to harden over time. That is, we take in cognitively those things with which we tend to agree, and we tend to push aside those things with which we think we have a fundamental disagreement. So we push those things to the side, and one of the results of that is that the firm beliefs that we have about how the world operates tend themselves to be self-reinforcing over time. And this is a phenomenon that I would say has been exacerbated enormously in the last 5 to 10 years with the advent of very, very particularized niche-based social and other media. That is, we tend to pay very close attention to those sources on whom we think we can rely justifiably in our own minds, and we tend to ignore those sources that produce a contrary kind of view of the world.
Well, that's confirmation bias.
To the
that's true enough.
Question. That is, when you say I pick up the paper, if one had picked up another paper, the premises and the common sense assumptions would be quite different, possibly. And so one of the things that I think we see going on at the moment, and the way in which this has become extremely troublesome, is that as people pay attention to very particular sources of information or misinformation or disinformation, those things don't simply look like opinions to them. They look like and become part of people's identity. So rather than being susceptible to argumentation, to evidence, to contrary views, we tend, in fact, to stick even closer to those things that we think we believe about how the world operates. And we can see many, many examples of this. I think one of the best examples is what's happened in the light of the pandemic. What's happened with certain kinds of protective behaviors, what's happened with vaccinations. All of these things have hardened now into very politicized and non-evidence-based camps in many instances. So common sense, this idea of how the world works, not only descriptively, but how it ought to work normatively, is our starting point for thinking about how social change might occur. That is, if we begin to take apart and to demonstrate the constructiveness of those elements of common sense that are most fundamental to the way life operates, it produces a set of very unpredictable outcomes. Once that knot, as you put it, begins to be unraveled, it's very unclear where it will take us. But as I say, that's a beginning point for us to think about how social change might occur.
So
we have to
so their basic premise, and someone in the chat, please correct me if you think I got this wrong. Their basic premise seems to be that social change will occur when they are able to discredit capitalism in the minds of people so that those people start clamoring for a different system. And it's not necessarily even that like they have the system ready to go. They don't even know what the system is going to be exactly. Okay, I think we know what they want it to be, but they're basically saying like we don't like this could turn out like we don't know exactly how this is going to turn out. But basically what I heard is he was talking about just trying to discredit the idea of capitalism to get people to open up their minds to a different type of system. Please let me know if you heard something differently, but that was what I heard. And it seems to me that if you want to fundamentally discredit the idea of capitalism, a really great way to do that would be to teach classes in places like the University of Arizona. That seems to me to be a really great strategy to do that.
Dismantle those things that people take for granted, leave completely unexamined, and simply move on, and show their constructedness and show that they could be constructed otherwise. That, I think, is a really significant element of social change. The arc of the course then follows from that, and the arc of the book follows from that. If we ask a question about predominant common sense, what is the predominant common sense at the moment? And for us, in the book, in the course, we have come to characterize that predominant common sense as something that other scholars, other activists have called capitalist realism. And it's encapsulated in an interesting kind of phrase, which I think we'll talk about a great deal more, that it is now easier, in some respect, to imagine the end of the world than to imagine the end of capitalism. And that little phrase, I think, helps signify the degree to which that capitalist mindset in its particular variants, particularly the neoliberal form, has taken hold of our imaginaries and doesn't allow for counter imaginaries of any serious kind. And so for us, to think about that realism, that capitalist realism, as the dominant hegemonic common sense, that is the predominant, unallowing questions, so forth, leads to a set of consequences, which is where the title of the book comes from. Some of those are existential threats to humanity or to the planet or both. Some of them are the everyday violences that the neoliberal, financialized, globalized form of present-day state capitalism has taken, the violences of vast inequality, poverty, food insecurity, and so forth. And then leads us to a set of questions about how this can all be resisted. And here, I think, Janine, to return to one of the elements of your question, is where we turn to history in some measure to think about those moments when the common sense, the absolutely rock hard, concrete common sense, was itself subverted in very substantial ways in order to move societies or segments of societies in very new and sometimes progressive directions. But in any event, that's the arc, of course, and the way in which common sense fits in.
Thank you very much. Yes, the thing with common sense is you buy the premise, you buy the bit. You know, once you accept a certain view of things, all manner of consequences are acceptable because they're unavoidable or because they are terrible but necessary to get to some implied future circumstance of happiness and harmony. Well, Noam, sometimes the obvious nonsense of the common sense becomes so overbearing that it can't be ignored. And one of the ways in which capitalistic common sense seems so nonsensical is the treatment of the land, water, and air that ultimately sustain the system.
They're about to make an ESG play. Holy shit. Did you notice that transition to, no, we're not talking about capitalism. Let's talk about climate change, climate justice. Holy shit.
We think of capitalistic owners as cynical, maybe even heartless, but generally not as stupid. And the idea that nature itself can be treated as an input, that non-renewable resources can be economically accounted for as though they were unlimited, to an observer, you know, from space, if you will, that looks like dancing off a cliff. That looks like magical thinking. You know, we just want this to be true, that we can keep doing this. So we'll just say it's true, even as violent weather and sea level rise and deforestation rage. What is the sense of capitalism being reflected right now? Not just in the bare fact that fossil fuel companies are continuing to do the thing that's killing the earth underneath them and to profit from it, but in the fact that there seems to be no sufficiently powerful countervailing actor. Our systems are not acting decisively to curtail the harm, even though inaction seems so irrational.
Well, take a look at what just happened in Glasgow the last couple of days.
Right.
There were countervailing forces. As you know, the biggest delegation in Glasgow at the COP26 conference was lobbyists. Corporate lobbyists outweighed everyone else. And their task was quite simple. It was to ensure that there will be maximization of profit for the wealthy, the powerful, the corporate sector in the short term, even if it means destruction of human life on Earth in the longer term. But there were countervailing forces. They weren't sitting in on the conferences. They were out in the streets. So there were hundreds of thousands of people, mostly young, demonstrated out in the streets and say, we would prefer to have decent lives, in fact, lives altogether, and survival. That's the countervailing force.
They're
Now,
arguing that we're all going to die still.
Countervailing or not depends on us. It's there, mostly young people, which is a sharp condemnation of my generation, your generation as well. It's younger people who are out there forming the potential countervailing force that could save us. Now, what about those who are inside? Is their position nonsensical or is it rational? Depends on the framework in which you pick. If the framework is we should have is the concern for what's called the common good, human beings, other species we are mercilessly destroying, if they have rights and should have a decent future for them, within that framework, it's irrational. But there's another framework in which it is quite rational. How can I enrich myself tomorrow? Within that framework, it's entirely rational. And you can see it very concretely. So just think of concrete situations. There's a lot of talk about market systems. It's very misleading. We have highly limited market systems, but they're shaped and constrained by power in their interests. But to some extent, there is a competitive market. So suppose, let's say there are two automobile companies, let's say Ford and General Motors. And suppose you're the CEO of Ford, and you decide it might be worthwhile to think about the common good. So I'll put resources into developing automobiles that will help society survive, and they'll be operative in 10 years. Suppose your competitor says, sorry, I want to make profit tomorrow. So I'm going to put the same resources into something that'll sell tomorrow. Well, 10 years from now, Ford will be out of business. Okay, that's what's called a competitive market. As soon as the market was made somewhat more operative under the neoliberal regime, starting with Reagan, a little before, but mainly Reagan, then yes, competitive forces began to take place, and what you had was monopolization. Big fish eat the little fish. Pretty soon, you have no choices. Your society is basically run by autocrats who are unaccountable to the public. You can't stand your internet service. Sorry, you have no choice. The only choice is maybe two companies which are in collusion to ensure that prices go as high as possible. You would like to have drugs at a reasonable price, won't work. There's monopolization, near monopolization, which ensures that there's no competition. You could go to Canada, which is a little more open in this respect, and get cheaper drugs, but
not anymore.
A lot of barriers against that. So that's what happens within the framework of saying, I better make profit tomorrow or I'm out of the game. It makes sense to say, let's destroy the world. Or suppose...
Yeah, I'm not, how is socialism better? How is socialism better? Because in a free market, people can start businesses, new businesses can rise. It happens all the time. Even when there are really big businesses in the game, new businesses rise all the time. So how is socialism better? Because you're telling me that you don't like capitalism because you only get one choice if someone gets really big and really good at what they're doing, so big and so good at what they're doing that all the customers go to them. But how is it different with the government? How would it be different if all of my healthcare had to run through the government? Well, I wouldn't get any choice then either. What's going to make that better? Yeah, Tom J says Gnome always sprinkles in enough truths to keep you listening, then bam, cracks the shell to make some eggs. Yes. It's nuggets of truth covered in a mound of bullshit.
Say you're the CEO of JP Morgan Chase, biggest American bank, and you would like, if you look back at the COP26 discussions, which are kind of interesting on the inside, not the outside, there was a lot of talk about how we now have $136 trillion available in the hands of the major financial institutions. And since they are all wonderful people dedicated to the service of the human species, they will use that $136 trillion to ensure that everything works out. There'll be what used to be called soulful corporations. When the corporations come under criticism, they put on an act of how they're soulful corporations working hard, to ensure that everyone will be best off. You could listen to the U.S. Representative John Kerry, who was ecstatic at the fact that now we have the market working for us. The corporate sector is now fully committed to taking care of the whole problem of the financial crisis. Well, now put yourself back in the position of the CEO of JP Morgan Chase or Larry Fink and BlackRock and say, suppose I try to do what I'm talking about. Suppose I try to put money into saving the environment instead of making more profit tomorrow. What happens?
Why can't you do
Tomorrow,
both?
I'm kicked out by the board of directors and somebody else
That's
comes
not
in
true.
who's
That's
gonna
not
be
true.
doing-
That is not true. He is making such blanket statements. There is an entire corporate structure. It's called the oh fuck. Is it the B Corp? I think it's the B Corp. There is an entire corporate structure structured around social responsibility. So it is blatantly false to say that all capitalist structures will kick out someone if they want to make decisions based on the environment. That's blatantly false. These things happen all the time, and they don't kick the CEO out. It is a B Corp. I thought it was a B Corp. No, there is a C Corp too, but I'm pretty sure it's a B Corp. And like you have to meet certain standards in order to be registered as a B Corp, and there's supposed to be like, prestige in having a B Corp and all those things. Most people don't know what it is, but yeah, that does actually exist.
doing exactly this. So the rational thing for me to do is stay on, destroy the world, because I'm a nice guy and I'll do it a little better than the other guy. But there's an institutional structure that says the position is going to be taken by someone who will be after short-term profit and will destroy the world. That's a part of the institutional framework. We accept that framework. It's rational behavior to commit suicide, to commit species suicide. There's more behind it. There is a neoliberal ideology, not different, but radically different from general capitalist ideology, but it is out in an extreme. It's an extreme form of capitalist ideology. Should say that it was well described at the origins of capitalism by someone we're encouraged to revere but not read. His name is Adam Smith. Adam Smith understood very well the kind of system that would develop if capitalism was allowed to run free. He discussed what he called the masters of mankind. In his day, that meant the merchants and manufacturers of England. Nowadays, it means multinational corporations, financial institutions, and so on. He said, the masters of mankind pursue what he called their vile maxim, all for ourselves, nothing for anyone else. That's part of the nature of the system that they're working for. And he went on in words that are very instructive for us today. He said, the masters of mankind in England are also the principal architects of government policy. And they will, because of their enormous economic power, and they will ensure that the government state policies preserve their interests. As he put it, make sure that our interests are most peculiarly attended to, however grievous the effect on others, including the people of England. But primarily, he said, those who are subject to the savage injustice of the Europeans, particularly the British in India. At the time, Britain was destroying and deindustrializing India. Well, he was very perceptive. That's what happens when you let neoliberal ideology run free. And the ideology is right in front of us. You can read it in what are called novels by people like Ayn Rand, for example. All for yourself, nothing for anyone else. That's heroism. You can read it in policy formation.
If you don't take care of yourself, then you can't help and serve other people. This is something people don't talk about as much. If you don't take care of yourself, if you don't make sure your needs are met, if you don't make sure your bills are paid, you can't take care of other people. And we don't have any innate obligation to take care of other people. That just makes no sense at all. Like, you have to take care of yourself first. Incognito says, and Adam Smith literally tried socialism before it was even coined and realized it couldn't work because the majority was wanting the minority to take care of them. Capitalism saved that colony. I think it's a great point, Incognito.
Take Milton Friedman, the economic guru of the neoliberal movement, when he declared right at the beginning that corporations have only one responsibility: to enrich themselves, and of course to enrich the salaries of their management.
Yes.
It's an interesting comment from an economist. He knew very well, of course, that the forming corporation is a gift given to you by the society, confers many advantages. If you don't want to accept the advantages, you don't have to incorporate. You can be a partnership. But if you incorporate, you're accepting a gift from the society. But the gift carries no responsibility. Your sole responsibility is the vile maxim: all for ourselves, nothing for anyone else. Well, that's the reigning ideology. It was put into practice. When Reagan came into office, you probably recall his inaugural address. There's a crucial line in it. It said, "Government is the problem, not the solution." Well, what does that mean? Government is not the place to have decisions made. That's a problem. Decisions don't go away. They're made somewhere else.
Exactly. Freedom comes from self-sufficiency.
Concentrations of private power will make the decisions. And that makes sense from the point of view of the practitioners of the vile maxim, the masters of mankind, because the government has a severe flaw. It's partially accountable to the public, not very much, but partially at least. In principle, those demonstrate.
They think socialism is a better idea because the government is partially responsible to the public, whereas corporations have no responsibility to the public. I got news for you, Noam. If you piss off your customers, they're going to stop being your customers. Like you do have an accountability to the public. You have a very direct accountability to the public. And then if you piss them off, they're going to go somewhere else, or they're just going to stop buying your product altogether. But to say the government it has accountability to people, no, they don't. Not in any way do they have accountability to people. And that's certainly not a good argument for socialism.
Traders out in the streets of Glasgow have some kind of voice, and that's dangerous. We want to ensure that that doesn't happen. So let's get rid of the institution that partially reflects their voice and put decisions in the hands of the people who know what they're, the soulful corporations, those who are following the vile maxim. Margaret Thatcher, our counterpart on the other side of the Atlantic, as she put it famously, she said, "There is no alternative. You have to pursue the vile maxim, nothing else." She added that there's no society, just individuals. She was either a liar or a fool, and I doubt that she was a fool. She knew perfectly well that there is a rich, complex society for the masters.
The masters are the ones who have whiteness.
Chamber of Commerce,
That's
trade
whiteness.
associations,
Whiteness.
all sorts of institutions set up for them to coordinate their activities and ensure that they can jointly pursue effectively the vile maxim. But there's no society for anyone else. Everyone else
What are you talking about?
thrown on the market to somehow survive its ravages. Not the rich. They don't face the market. We have what number of economists, well, Paul and Jeffrey Gene Epstein have called a bailout economy. If the rich get into trouble, which they do frequently, the hated government steps in and bails them out. That means the friendly taxpayer bails them out. This increased radically under Reagan with neoliberalism. Before Reagan, financial institutions had been
They're calling Reagan neoliberalist.
Regulated, no financial crises. Treasury Department forced the rules, collected taxes, and so on. That disappeared when you moved to Reagan. Huge growth of financial institutions, mostly predatory, harm the economy, but enormous component of the economy regularly get into serious trouble. One financial crisis after another caused by their activities, but the friendly taxpayer comes in and bails them out. That's neoliberal capitalism. It's a form. Capitalism is, you look up the dictionary, it gives a definition of neoliberalism in terms of, following market principles and so on. It's all nonsense. You look at the practice of neoliberalism, the definition is very simple. Vicious class war by the masters. Unrestrained class war. That's neoliberalism. Every aspect of it follows from that assumption.
Every time he says the masters, you need to think whiteness, because that's how the left is using these terms. They're conflating these terms. He might not be doing it directly in what he's saying, but remember, Noam Chomsky is old school. Noam Chomsky was around before critical race theory. Noam Chomsky has been around forever and a day. So it is entirely possible that Noam Chomsky, being that he's an old man that has been around forever, might not realize that they've done this. But every single time he says the masters, I need you to think whiteness. Because the people that are using the term whiteness right now are using it in exactly the same way that he is using the term the masters.
And there's a cost to the population. There's actually been efforts to estimate it. So the most respected research institution, the quasi-governmental RAND Corporation, recently tried to do an estimate of what they call politely the transfer of wealth, impolitely robbery of the large majority of the population by the very rich. How much wealth has been transferred during the neoliberal years from the lower 90% of the population, working class, poor, to the hands of the super rich, mostly a fraction of 1%. Their estimate is about $50 trillion of robbery in the past 40 years. It's actually an underestimate, but let's leave it at that. That's pretty rational.
Yeah.
Go back to why it's rational. Why not? If you can steal $50 trillion for a fraction of 1% of the population who doubled their share of income, what's irrational?
It makes sense. Yeah, it makes sense. Well, thank you. And despite all of that, and in that context, and I want to say the book does a terrific job of countering these sort of narratives and storylines we hear about the way markets work, the way economies work, with the reality of how they actually work. But it's surprising, in a way, even miraculous, that movements toward the liberation of people do happen within this context and despite these factors. And Marv, I want to come back to you because we do want to talk, and the book does talk about how these movements for liberation, for justice happen, what some of the ingredients are. So we need to talk tonight about some of the fault lines in neoliberalism, in capitalism, that the COVID-19 pandemic has thrown into relief. We've started to already address that. One inflection point was political leaders and their pundit megaphones just straight up saying, your livelihood or your life, you know, as though that were a reasonable and necessary demand. What we're now hearing called the Great Resignation, Striketober, and now maybe it's going to be Strikevember. I love how they're very interested to constrain it to 1 month, you know. This is being portrayed as workers suddenly getting fed up. And you hear fed up a lot. The suggestion there is that this is an emotional response, and therefore wiser heads need to prevail. There's also an implication that as an emotional, anger-based response, it's going to blow over, and it should blow over. And what it should not do is fundamentally shift the relationship between labor and capital. Can you talk, Marv, about the place that I think you see as pivotal, the place of labor relations in particular in broader social change? What in the present circumstance, which we know involves not just unions, but also other organized groups of workers, what connects what we're seeing now with the ingredients of social change as you understand them? What are some of the seeds that you see that history suggests can be not just Striketober, but something that might actually change things in a more lasting way?
Well, let me circle back just briefly to the idea of common sense and how it plays into this question. There's a very long and sordid history that has produced one group of people as the owners of the means of production with absolute tyrannical control over the workplace, and another group of people who have no choice but to submit themselves on a daily basis, if they can, to that tyranny. That is, why do we have a group of people who are the bosses and a group of people who are nothing but the workers? Well,
those workers could become the bosses if they wanted to.
Expropriation.
Those workers aren't assigned to be workers forever.
Not only is there a recent upward transfer of wealth, but going back to the very beginnings of capitalism, we have the absolute expropriation of people's land, livelihood, tools, talents, so forth, so that at the end of the day, people have nothing, as Marx said, do but sell their skins to somebody who is a willing buyer. And that's a crucial point. In a money economy where one group owns the means of production, they have the choice to buy labor power or not buy anything at all. A worker has to sell his or her own set of skills to a particular buyer if that buyer is interested. So here we have a situation, basically, where the labor relation, where there's absolutely no question that what happens in the workplace under typical circumstances, there's no question that those who own the means of production, the managers, the owners, get to decide what is going to be produced, how it's going to be produced, what to do, if anything, with the profits, if there are any. And the workers basically subject themselves to that arrangement, again, largely without question under most circumstances. So under the pandemic, one of the things that we saw was an interesting contradiction at the outset of the conversation about the pandemic. Who were called the essentials? it wasn't the people at the top. It was the people on the front lines in various kinds of workplaces, whether they were restaurant workers, healthcare workers, home healthcare workers, retail workers, people who brought us all the goods and services on which the society depends for its existence and for its functioning. But that turned very, very quickly away from these are the people who are essential workers who must be celebrated, protected, and cherished in some fashion.
Marv, are you suggesting that was all bullshit? Are you suggesting the entire pandemic was bullshit in order to destroy our economy, driven by the Democratic Party? I know I am shocked at this revelation that the entire fucking pandemic was bullshit and was a deliberate plot to destroy our economy ahead of an election. I know I am shocked at this revelation.
To the
And when I say the pandemic was bullshit, YouTube, I don't mean like, you know, whatever. I don't even know what YouTube's rules are with this anymore. I'm not saying that COVID wasn't real. That's not what I'm suggesting. I am suggesting that the rhetoric around the pandemic was completely blown out of proportion with the specific political motivation of destroying the economy ahead of an election that they wanted to win. I'm not arguing that COVID's not real, YouTube. Go fuck yourselves with your fucking strikes. That's not the argument that's being made. COVID is absolutely real. I had it. As did most of you.
essence of your question, which was, under what circumstances did that shift to this Sophie's choice between making a living and being in dire circumstances? And we're seeing reverberations of that in the present conversations around unemployment, about the need to return to the workplace and so forth, which now has translated what were at the outset of the conversation essential workers into the return of people who are subservient to the needs of the bosses. They must be seen, they must be surveilled, they must be observed, they must in fact toe the line extraordinarily. There's an interesting kind of saying about this, that under capitalism, the only thing worse than being exploited is not being exploited. And so for the people who are not hired back into the workplace under these circumstances, or choose not to be in the workplace under these circumstances, situation is dire. There's no other way under most circumstances, certainly in the developed world and increasingly in the developing world, where land grabs of all kinds are going on at a phenomenal rate. There's virtually no way to make a living, even a subsistence living, without selling oneself for a wage.
That's not true.
And so the idea that if
that is such a lie. The fact,
start to be
hang
pulled
on,
apart,
the fact that these two are teaching college students that there's just no way to make a living in the world, it really pisses me off. There are millions of ways to make money in the world that have nothing to do with working for someone else. There are an infinite number of ways to be financially successful in the world. And that's because of capitalism. That's because of free markets. You don't need to go to work for someone else to be successful in the world. And people have got to stop teaching young people that you do. It's not true at all. Tom J., this is Gnome's fourth pandemic. And again, he suggested we starve everyone that didn't take the vaccine. Well, you know, I forgive Gnome slightly because he's so old. He might not even know where he is anymore. I don't know. But I hear you, Tom J, and I don't disagree with your statement. I'm just like, I'm a little bit more forgiving of Gnome because I feel like he can barely talk.
and I think we have a number of examples of this. So worker-owned cooperatives, other kinds of arrangements for what
worker-owned cooperatives
work,
are usually so effed up, like in how they actually operate. They're so fucked up. Which is an
important component of thinking about how we recharacterize that relationship. The idea that there's a great deal of work to be done, but not all of it is, as David Graeber described, bullshit jobs, where people are simply there to get the wage that they then spend back to other capitalists to get the goods and services that they have been acculturated to desire which is another whole element of this question. What constitutes the good life? What constitutes quality of life? What constitutes those things that capitalists are then enjoined to deliver to us? And I'll say something more about that in 1 second. But the idea that if those relationships could be opened up for question, again, it's unpredictable what other kinds of things might be subjected to question. But again, the idea that the common sense, that the only way people can exist in the world is to sell or rent themselves out for a wage, is itself cordoned off from any discussion of alternatives. So the fact that there are now literally thousands of alternative workplaces in the United States is rarely covered in the media. And if it's covered in the media at all, they're covered as aberrational. They're not covered as absolutely sensible kinds of rearrangements of how people might, in fact, make a living and make it in a much more meaningful way than simply subjecting themselves to the tyrannical whims of an employer. So all of those kinds of things.
All employers are tyrannical. Got it.
Why questioning labor relations is so central to all kinds of.
So if every single employer in the world is tyrannical, and we should never subject ourselves to the whims of a tyrannical employer, then how in the ever-loving hell do these people think that the government is going to be less tyrannical when they are the only option that is available to everyone? If every single employer, from big corporations all the way down to like small businesses, if every single one of them are tyrannical and they're all run by people, and by the way, those people would be the same people in charge of running the government, then how in the ever-loving hell is the government not going to turn tyrannical? When they are the only option in town because you've gotten rid of all the private businesses because you hated capitalism.
Other change. It doesn't mean that other elements are unimportant, but that is one of the sort of hallmark taken for granted notions of a capitalist system, is that the only way to make it in the world is to rent or sell oneself for a wage. Let me just circle back very briefly to this issue of quality of life. When Noam was talking about what it is that the CEO of Ford might decide to produce versus the CEO of General Motors and so forth, that itself has a certain set of presumptions built into it about what it is consumers desire or are made to desire. And those kinds of questions are really never opened up. Again, it's the capitalists themselves in their anarchic fashion who make the decisions about what to produce, how to produce it, when to produce it, under what circumstances, including devastating circumstances for the planet, that are in those hands and those hands alone. And again, we take this pretty much for granted. So if we were able to open up this whole question of what constitutes quality of life, what are the real sources of happiness and satisfaction, rather than simply acceding to those things that the capitalist system tells us are the elements of a good life, of quality of life. We might then also alter some of the arrangements under which those things are either produced or not produced. We might, in fact, move to much more sort of democratic decisions about production itself, which in fact might alter the way in which we interact both with each other and with the planet itself. But again, an element of hegemonic common sense is to rule out alternative imaginaries as ruthlessly as possible. So the example of something that might in fact present a very different way of organizing society is, as I say, ruthlessly rooted out or trivialized and made nonsensical. So I think labor relations, to the extent that they could be questioned, the taken for granted nature of this relationship between workers and capitalists, could in fact open up all kinds of other questions that themselves, I think, are conducive to thinking about the nature of change.
Thank you very much. And no, my next question to you really builds directly off of Marv's response there, because one of the formative undercurrents of the U.S. official response to the pandemic was U.S. exceptionalism. Other countries are paying workers to stay home and guaranteeing their jobs. Other countries are doing things differently and acknowledging health and livelihood at the same time. But we can't do that because America. Usually those constraints are a little more hidden or more subtle, but here we really saw, don't look behind the curtain. Just come back to work and risk your life for $10 an hour, very overt. But that exceptionalism, like other narratives that we're talking about, has to be studiously maintained. And a key part of that is ignoring and erasing alternatives. So as Marv has just been saying, we have worker collaboratives in this country. We have mutual aid groups. We have, to take it along another vector, communities replacing police with social workers, criminal structures being replaced with restorative justice. Virtually all of the things that we're being told can't happen, couldn't happen in the United States are happening somewhere on some scale. And as we move towards the conclusion of this conversation and we want to be looking forward, I think one of the things I want to ask, and I think one of the things people want to hear is, what do we need to do to amplify some of those alternative models to support them or protect them, given that we understand they're going to be antithetical and maybe potential targets of purveyors of the status quo? How do we help amplify those alternative models? And what's holding us back from seeing these different structures as things that we could do, as things that we all could do?
Well, first of all, we should recognize that there's some truth to the notion of American exceptionalism. By American, I don't mean the people of the United States. I mean the policies of the masters who...
Whiteness.
The masters of mankind,
Whiteness.
back to Adam Smith's formulation, who control government policies. So take something as simple as, say, maternity leave. If you look at polls, I forgot the exact numbers, but I think Americans favor it by about 90% or something like that. Well, turns out we're the only country with, except for a couple of Pacific islands, that doesn't have maternity leave. You paid maternity leave. Of course, a woman can take off and starve if she likes, but literally, it's true. It's the United States and a half a dozen Pacific islands. You go to the next biggest country in the Western Hemisphere, Brazil, it's a poor country, 4 months of guaranteed paid maternity leave, supported ultimately by Social Security, which then can be extended 2 months further. Much of the world is also paternal leave. It's unheard. You can't even imagine in the United States. And this generalizes. There was an interesting comment by one of the editors of the world's leading business journal, not a radical journal, London Financial Times, Rana Forhar, sort of quipped, half in jest, but it's actually true. She said that if Bernie Sanders was living in Germany, he could be running on the right-wing Christian Democrat program, which actually is literally true. You take a look at his main programs, which are described as too radical for Americans: universal health care, free higher education. It's everywhere. Right south of the border, Mexico, rich countries like Germany, the best performers on educational measures, Finland, Brazil, anywhere you look, universal health care, Maybe it's not great, but at least it's there. You can go to the hospital if you need it without sitting outside for an hour and filling out insurance forms while you're bleeding to death and so on. But it's there. Same with free higher education, almost everywhere. In fact, the US used to have it too when we were a much poorer country back in the 1950s, much poorer country. There was something called the GI Bill, which provided free higher education and subsidies to a huge part of the population.
Thank you, Bod. I'm sure I got it.
Notice
I'm probably just getting sicker as I'm sitting here.
It was for white males, the ones who had been in the army. Segregation ensured that. But it was there. It was very beneficial to the people, very beneficial to the country. Now somehow we're much richer, but we can't do what they can do in super rich countries like Mexico, a couple miles south of us. Well, that generalizes. Actually, if you think about it, there is universal medical care in the United States. It's called emergency rooms. If you can drag yourself to an emergency room and get through filling out all the forms and so on, they'll sooner or later take care of you, maybe after a couple of days, and give you good medical care. Of course, you'll get charged for it later, maybe a bit you can't pay, but it's the most savage and costly kind of medical care you can imagine. But we have it, you know, and this goes all the way back. It goes way back to the origins of American history. The United States has a very highly class conscious business class. They're consciously fighting bitter class war. Know what they're doing, thinking about it, organized, never stop. And it's partly because of the way American history worked. There wasn't any feudal structure. European capitalism grew out of a feudal background. Feudal background was pretty horrible, but people did have a place and had rights, some kind of rights, maybe rotten rights, but some rights. In a tabula rasa, you know, empty, nothing, you have no rights. And it was an empty continent once you exterminated the population and drove them out. Yes, then it was nice and empty. And you had the government providing advantages to the more privileged, like the Homestead Act and so on. There was resistance out of a very violent labor history. There was extensive resistance, and we can learn a lot from it. When the Industrial Revolution was beginning in the 19th century, mid-19th century, working people were following exactly the principles that Marv described. They were saying, we don't want to be subject to masters. That's the worst attack on human rights and dignity you can imagine, is having a job where you rent yourself to a master. We don't want that. That was public opinion, incidentally. Such strong public opinion that it was a slogan of the Republican Party under Lincoln, that that wage labor is different from slavery only in that it's temporary. Now, Lincoln and the Republican Party took an individualist interpretation of this. They meant until you, the individual, can become free. But the working people didn't accept that. They took a collectivist view to it. They said, freedom for us means running our own enterprises.
Which you can do in capitalism, no?
Not subject.
You can run your own fucking enterprises in capitalism. That's the whole point.
It was a major labor organization, Knights of Labor, which broke through all kind of barriers. Very racist country. The first act of the Knights of Labor was to try to organize Black Louisiana workers, rural workers. And they tried hard to develop a non-racist, cooperative labor movement based on common ownership, mutual support. At the same time, in rural America, which is the large majority of the population then, it was an agricultural country, farmers in Texas, Oklahoma, Kansas were organizing to try to free themselves from the control of Northeastern bankers and market managers. They wanted to set up what they called a cooperative commonwealth, in which farmers would work together cooperatively to decide what to plant, to help each other in the planting and the harvests, make their own banks.
They can do all of this under the free market. There is absolutely nothing that Noam is describing right now that cannot be achieved under the free market. I don't know what there is so hard to understand about this. I don't get it. If farmers want to work together to form a collective or whatever the fuck, they are allowed to do that. No one is stopping them.
So on. Now, these two that was the populist movement. Nothing like what's called populist today. It was a radical democratic movement of farmers. The populist movement and the Knights of Labor began to integrate, and that led to an outburst of violence, state and corporate violence, which smashed it. And that's been we could be a very different country if that had succeeded. Very different. We'd have a different common sense. But it continues right through history. The labor movement was pretty much crushed, revived again in the 1930s in a very significant way with a lot of lessons. That's my childhood. I can remember it. By the mid 30s, labor organizing was beginning. CIO was being organized, began to carry out militant labor actions like sit-down strikes. Sit-down strikes are very frightening to the masters because they're one step away from saying, we don't need you. We can run this place ourselves and do it better than you can. It's a very thin distinction. And right at that point, when the sit-down strikes were starting, the masters changed their tune. The courts stopped blocking New Deal measures. They began to accept them. The business leaders said, we got to accommodate to this somehow, or else we're going to lose everything. You got the New Deal programs, which changed the society enormously. There's been a major attack on them under neoliberalism, but they still remain and they support our lives. Well, that's one that teaches us something. And the masters understand it. In the late 60s and the early 70s, there was extensive, serious labor organizing, mostly young people, a lot of it out of the organized unions, women, farm workers, young workers in places like Lordstown, striking not just for higher wages, but for dignity and control of the workplace. That again elicited a very strong reaction, including violence and the neoliberal shift, which was largely motivated by concern that things are getting out of hand. They're getting out of control. There's what they call excessive democracy. We have to
excessive democracy.
Business of women, workers, young people, old people trying to press their demands in the political arena. Took many forms. One of them was a massive business offensive to institute what became the neoliberal regression. And we should recall that neoliberalism wasn't invented there. It goes back to mid 1920s interwar Austria. That's the origins of the neoliberal movement. And it was worth recognizing that it was strongly anti-union. It celebrated the destruction of unions by the proto-fascist governments, ecstatic about it. It was pro-fascist. The leading guru of the neoliberal movement, Ludwig von Mises, still greatly honored, was an enthusiastic supporter of fascism. Said fascism has saved Western civilization. It's rescued it from the effort of working people to interfere with the holy market by organizing to protect themselves and defend their rights. So it's a good thing that the black shirts came in and smashed all that up by violence. It'll go down in history as a gift to America, to Western civilization. The next appearance of neoliberalism was in Pinochet's Chile. As soon as the vicious, murderous Pinochet dictatorship came in, it was media flocked, the neoliberal economists flocked there, all the major figures. Friedrich Hayek said he'd never seen so much freedom. It's marvelous. Wasn't able to hear the cries from the torture chambers somewhere else. After that, they moved to a bigger task, taking over the global economy. That's neoliberalism. Its basis is violence to ensure the dominance of the masters. They may have nice, pleasant words about markets and so on, but when you look, that's what it is. As soon as Reagan came in, initiating what was going to be clearly major class war, first step was to break the unions, introduce scabs, which were illegal in every country outside of apartheid South Africa, open the door for corporations to do the same, make sure that the workers have no means to defend themselves against the class war that was being initiated. Thatcher in England did exactly the same thing. Again, very rational. When you're going to carry out bitter class war, make sure the victims can't defend themselves, either by organizations or by ideology. We get to what Marv was describing.
I mean, Gnome to me really doesn't seem to believe in people all that much. That's what I find so depressing about these people is Gnome really doesn't believe that like an average person is capable of like building a business and creating a life that they want within the system that we have. He really thinks that people are just beholden to these kind of like evil overlord beings that are the bosses and the masters. I think that's a really sad worldview. I think it's really, really sad. It's kind of like when Deb Philbin says, oh, I'm just trying to protect parents from Carlin on Twitter. Like, it's like you don't think that parents are smart enough to like watch my content and decide whether or not they think that I'm doing something good? Like, it's not your job to baby people. It is not your job to protect people. You have to let people protect themselves. You have to let people learn and grow and figure things out. But it really, it's like, it's such, this doesn't resonate with me at all. I don't know. I mean, are you guys seeing this too? And I'm sorry I'm not being more kind of like overt tonight because I'm just not like feeling all that great. But it's like, Tom J, he's smart, but not smart enough to know he knows nothing. It really bums me out when people in the position to influence a massive number of people, as Noam Chomsky is in the position to do, when they fundamentally don't believe in people. When they fundamentally don't believe that people have the ability to take care of themselves, where they don't need mommy and daddy to do everything for them. It's just really sad.
Very different from
We got about
the working class.
15 minutes left, guys. 15 minutes left. Hang in.
20th century. Now, the highest goal you can imagine is getting a job. That is, being what used to be called a slave.
No, that's not the highest goal you can imagine.
By subordination to a master.
Whiteness.
And that's a change in common sense, but it can go back. And the alternative systems that are being described are ways in which the common sense is being overthrown, and we're moving towards the kind of...
I hope no one listening to this ever allows someone else to make them believe that they're not capable of doing something that you want to do. You can do whatever you want to do in this world. Do not believe anyone that says to you, well, what about this? That's going to prevent you from doing it. Or what about that? Or what about this other thing? Or what about this? Or what about that? every single person who has ever built something has had to encounter similar obstacles. Like, that's okay, Sin. Have a good rest of your night. Every single person in the world who has ever tried to create something from nothing has encountered obstacles and challenges along the way. And I really hope that no one ever buys it. You have to believe in yourself. If you don't believe in yourself, then no one else is going to believe in you. And these people want to make you believe that you can't accomplish anything without some overlord giving their blessing for you to do it. And that is simply not true.
Decent society that workers in the 19th century, farmers in the 19th century were working towards. Cooperative commonwealth based on mutual aid, mutual support, common participation in making decisions about what life is going to be, out of the control of the masters of mankind who we get rid of. They have no reason to be there. Well, it's kind of like Glasgow and the young people in the streets and the suits in the offices. It's a battle, and who's going to win depends on what we do.
Could I just build a little bit on that?
Absolutely. I think it's a beautiful place to bring us to our conclusion. Before you even say that, Marv, I would only say that this is a perfect illustration of the way the book works to be a discursive, a conversation about history that is not static, but is dynamic, and that is talking about this history in ways that we can use it to move forward. So in our concluding moments, Marv, I would absolutely love to hear you build on what Noam has just said.
Yeah, I just want to look at one other sort of interesting element of what we think of as both American exceptionalism to some degree and a certain taken for granted commonsensical understanding of the world. And that is this idea of the American dream. And one formulation of that is a kind of positive formulation, which says that in America, if you work hard, if you play by the rules, you will make it, you will succeed. And I think this is very strongly held view, largely unexamined by many people, but it's certainly what has drawn many, many waves of immigrants to the United States as a kind of land of opportunity, so-called. But the obverse of that formulation is that if in America you don't make it, it is your own fault. There's absolutely no sense, going back to some things that Noam described as emerging from Ronald Reagan and emerging from Margaret Thatcher and so forth. There's nothing to bolster you up. There's no society underneath you, and that's okay. So that the American dream, its formulation is both descriptive and normative. That is, this is the way things are, and this is the way things should be. And it brings me to an interesting kind of comment that Joe Manchin made just a week or so ago, when he was, in fact, trying very, very arduously to undermine the Build Back Better bill, to undermine the reconciliation.
Oh, they're going after Joe Manchin. Oh, boo-hoo, too bad, so sad.
Very perplexing in a way. And it would, I think, help us to start to unpack this notion of this American dream formulation. He said, and he said this, I think, from the back of his yacht, on the back of his yacht called Almost Heaven, he said, the reason I'm opposed to a number of the measures in the Build Back Better bill is that I don't want us to become an entitlement society. And if you think about that just for a moment, it underlines, I think, a lot of the rationale for the tremendous wealth inequality and absolute divergence of segments of the population in the US at the moment, but elsewhere in the world as well. And I think one has to ask the question, why in the world would we not want to have an entitlement society? Why in the world should people struggle for the most basic elements of life while a few people are launching themselves into space? It struck me when Manchin said, I don't want this to become an entitlement society. It reminded me, and Noam used this phrase as well, it reminded me of what a brutal society the US is. It's a punishing society. And it
Really?
goes very much back to
You
the
seem to be
origins
doing
of the
rather
country.
well for such a
But I think
punishing
it's a
society
moment when we should
that you
start
hate.
to really question that issue of what it is that makes us a society, or what might make us a society. Why in the world would we not want people to be entitled to those things that are just fundamental in the Build Back Better bill, and even beyond that? Why in the world should people struggle every single day just to make ends meet so that their ends are not met? It seems to me that this is a moment when
Yes, he is
that
arguing
kind of
for
common
entitlement.
sense,
Yes, he
the
is.
idea that this society has to operate in the brutal fashion that it does. And this translates, I think, very effectively into our foreign policy, into our endless waging of war, and into all of the elements that make us, in many ways, quite exceptional, but not in the best way possible. So when Joe Manchin says, I don't want this to turn into an entitlement society, I simply say, why not?
Exactly. See?
We are going to close very shortly. I did want to just throw out a final question and give an opportunity for both of you to give final thoughts. I did want to introduce the idea that we recognize that a conversation about capitalism is not just about unions or even just about the paid workforce, right? We know that capitalism and its explored.
Tom J says the poorest Americans are living the American dream. 80% of the rest of the world would risk their lives to get. Good night, y'all. Yeah, Tom J, we're going to finish this up. We've only got 9 minutes left to go. But it's just like, again, these people are so pessimistic. And again, remember, these two are teaching this to a class at the University of Arizona right now. If you have kids that are going to the University of Arizona, ask them if they've taken this class and see what they have to say about it. I'd honestly be really curious. Tom J, I hope we'll see you tomorrow in movie night for Idiocracy.
In the book, it relies on homeless people as a kind of object lesson. Here's what will happen to you if you don't accept the deal that is offered. It relies on unpaid domestic labor, on prisons and prison labor. Work is a keystone framework that we use, but it's connected to other social phenomena. So I just want to say that conversations that I've been in, we have heard people say, yes, we need to move forward, but we don't want to be deflected from our core economic concerns. We want to engage the workers that have been ignored, and then that is usually followed by a reference to the Rust Belt. Oftentimes, when you scratch a little bit in these conversations, someone says something like, we basically need you to stop talking about being a woman or being an immigrant in the office or the shop floor or even in the union. We're going to get to those concerns later after we get our big win as workers. So my final questions for both of you, and either of you can answer, when we say that racism and sexism and other forms of discrimination and exploitation are integrated with capitalistic exploitation, does that mean that it's necessary to subsume or to sideline those concerns in our resistance to it? And I think this integrates with another theme in the book, which is the way that different movements for social justice have been kept separate and kept even at odds with one another. And I wonder, finally, what you both see, or either of you who wants to respond, see as an antidote to that separation. History may give us leads on that, but also to the idea that you need to stop thinking about the part of you that's a woman or that's Black or that's an immigrant, and just see yourself as a worker, and that's the way we're going to win. And you're making a problem if you ask for all of those concerns to be integrated. I just know that it's a very live problem for folks who are very actively engaged in trying to change the world. And I would like to hear both of you, as we, in our concluding 10 minutes, share your thoughts on that.
Go ahead, Marv. I'll just say a very brief answer, because you said these movements are being kept apart. It's a very crucial statement. Doesn't mean it, and the answer to being kept apart is to join together. That's, I think that's my view. That's basically what we have to know.
And I think in many ways, the course and the book is pointed at exactly that. I mean, our sense of this is that the diagnostic, that is to try to think about what is the sort of underlying fundamental causes of the various kinds of oppression, exploitation, and so forth. If we can understand their commonalities, and if they have structural, systemic, underlying sort of causal mechanisms, then those can be utilized to produce a kind of political coalition. That is, that people are all fighting, perhaps from very different sort of viewpoints, but fighting for same kinds of ends. Then the very, very deliberate and very, very vigorous attempts to keep those movements apart can be bridged. One of the fears, and I think this is one of the reasons why Noam characterized a lot of the history that's gone on as an unmitigated class warfare being fought largely by the 1%, by the elite class, much more effectively than those underneath. Their great fear is that those divisions, which they constantly manufacture, constantly reinforce, constantly emphasize, that those will somehow be bridged and people will in fact operate and act in their common interest against that class. So I think there's nothing that says that other dimensions of oppression need to be either minimized or trivialized, but the degree to which people can see commonalities in the production of their predicaments, then I think it provides a basis for political cohesion and political coalition and the ability to resist those efforts to keep people apart. That is, to think much more systemically about what is producing these problems, and the way in which to solve them is to form political coalition. Because as Noam has described many times, and the way we've talked about it in the course and in the book, there are many, many more of us than there are of them, which is also, I think, one of the underlying sort of considerations in all of this conversation about excess democracy. That is, to open those gates to people actually taking control of the system is anathema to those on top. So we see vigorous efforts, whether it's through voter suppression, through gerrymandering, through outright vote stealing and so forth, to make sure that that democracy doesn't overflow its bounds, its actual charted position in the society. But I do think there are many, many ways in which understanding the commonalities of problems helps lead us to a kind of political solution where coalition is much more likely than division.
I can't thank you enough for engaging that question, first of all, directly and honestly. And I just want to thank our guests, Noam Chomsky and Marv Gladstone, for joining us today. The book, let me get it in front of me, my many folded and penciled in book, Consequences of Capitalism, out now from Haymarket Books, based on lectures by these professors. I want to say again, it's a readable, accessible, and ultimately hopeful book. If you want to see,
I definitely think it sounds very hopeful, considering you're arguing for us to form a Marxist utopia. Guys, we're gonna cut it there. And again, I'm sorry that I wasn't more talkative tonight, or more spicy like I usually am. I'm just not feeling great. I don't have a lot of energy, but thank you for bearing with me. I'm glad we watched it anyway, because I mean, it just confirms it. you can totally see the parallels between where this ideology comes from and like critical race theory and like the gender stuff. And I think the more you watch this stuff, you can see that this is, I mean, they're all saying the same thing. Like the people who are spouting like the critical race theory bullshit and all the stuff we're saying on CNN, they're coming from this ideology. You can I hope people in the chat, even without me doing a lot of explaining tonight, can see the parallels between some of the ideas that were talked about in these two presentations and what we're seeing manifest on the woke left in the real world today. So yeah, so usually Yoshi, I'm much more talkative and I'm much more well, I guess a little spicy. But welcome. I hope you come back. We will be doing hopefully Socialism Saturday next week. But guys, I just want to remind you as we're wrapping up tonight, please mount that like button on your way out the door. Please subscribe to the channel if you have not already. And as a reminder, if you become a supporter of my work by going to activelyunwoke.com/support or by donating to my Indiegogo campaign, you will get an invite to my supporter Discord, which is important because we will be having movie night tomorrow night at 8 p.m. We are watching Idiocracy and we're going to be discussing it. And I think it's going to be a really great time. You get access to that by becoming a supporter either on Patreon or on Locals or on Substack or on my Indiegogo campaign, whatever's clever, whatever works best for you. I might recommend Locals tonight. Locals is the best place on the internet, I think. I have a really great time with my community, but you can become a supporter in whatever way works best for you. And we will do movie night tomorrow at 8 p.m. in the supporter Discord. Thank you guys for spending some time with me. I do really appreciate it. And I'll see you guys soon. Have a good one, guys.